I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly affairs, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. With these words, St. Paul gives each of us a radical call to holiness. And whatever state you find yourself, whether that's monastic or married. Did you hear what he said? He said, the married man is anxious about worldly affairs, how to please his wife. His interests are divided. So how can this be a call to married holiness in addition to monastic holiness? Well, I'll take this a step further. This is an inspiration for married holiness as well. In fact, monasticism is a model for marriage that is true Christian marriage because they derive from the same source. Paul says this, I say this to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. So let's first look at the original context and then how it applies to us today. So as I do this, please stay with me because we're going to also see how this passage can be misunderstood. But then we're going to conclude with how this points to the elevation of marriage. So monasticism, certain misunderstandings, and then marriage. This lectionary reading is short. It's a short selection from a much longer passage. Early in the chapter, Paul says, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain single as I do. Paul was probably a widower because all respectable Jewish men got married. But for him to tell all men to remain as I am, that was a radical change. Christianity made monasticism an ideal. And for the same reasons that monasticism became possible, Christian marriage became possible, which is not the same as marriage before. Christian marriage now has a monastic flavor. But it begs the question, if this is true, then why does Paul say the married man is anxious about worldly affairs, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided? First, this is one of Paul's first letters, and they would not yet have had the more Christian understanding of marriage that he presented about 10 years later when he was writing to the Ephesians. In Judaism, marriage was primarily a means of procreation and securing your legacy because the eternal perspective of our faith was not as clear. And they didn't have marriage as an analogy of the marriage of Christ in the church. And as a result, the Jewish recipients of Paul's letter came from a context where polygamy wasn't forbidden and divorce was easy. Second, the original context is what Paul calls the impending distress. Listen to this quote from earlier in the chapter. I think that in view of the impending distress, it is well for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek marriage. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. Brethren, the appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, for the form of this world is passing away. So that's the context, and what does this mean? Well, there's already persecution, and now he's warning of an impending distress. It would get worse. Now, this is referring, no doubt, to the coming destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD, which was a widespread massacre of the Jews. And understand, he's speaking to many Jewish Christians. But They're in a context where they were not only targeted by pagans, but also by Jews who resented their Christianity, fellow Jews. And so Christians, by being who they are, chose this distress to a certain level. They would not give in to Roman gods, and they also insisted that what they had was the completion of their Jewish faith. So they got it persecution from all sides. But they put Christ above all comfort. And in this context of a further impending distress, you can see why having a spouse could be what Paul says in another translation, a distraction. Now, we aren't quite in this kind of persecution right now, nor are most Christians throughout most of history. And so we're no longer under quite this impending distress. So the question is, do these words still apply? Now, someone might expect me to say no, but I'm going to say yes. Why? Because we're still called to choose an impending distress, which means choosing to wage war with a world that draws us away from God. In Paul's day, Christians faced a red martyrdom, but when this persecution ended, after Constantine, the highest calling was to choose what we often call a white martyrdom. That means dying to yourself and to the world. And if you want to do that, then the best way to do that is to remain as Paul is. That continues to be the highest calling. The Desert Fathers pioneered what this would look like, and their messages were passed down from elders to disciples, living in absolute simplicity and ideally in a desolate place, obedience to a rule of life, fasting to the fullest extent that you are able, all-night prayer vigils, praying without ceasing, literally. And for men, this also often includes, at least for men, often sleeping on the floor or on boards. This means living either as a hermit or with a community of others struggling the same way. That is the most direct route to holiness if you're free to do this. And in this context, again, a spouse could be what Paul calls a distraction. That's part of the monastic white martyrdom of waging war with the world by embracing the impending distress. And virtually all the early church fathers affirm, yes, that monasticism remains the highest calling. That being said, let's consider, though, a misinterpretation in our modern world. A misreading of this passage is that celibacy alone somehow opens the door to holiness. And a misreading is that getting married somehow closes the door to the level of holiness that a celibate person could reach. That's the impression, though, that some people get from this passage. Let me be clear. Paul is not merely advocating celibacy. All that celibacy means is not being married. No, he's advocating what we would now call monastic celibacy, a no-holds-barred spiritual struggle where detachment from this world, knowing Christ and making him known, is the only aim. That, brothers and sisters, is the highest calling. But a person can be single, that is celibate, and merely a bachelor. Even if one is chaste, that doesn't necessarily get one very far towards holiness. A lot of bachelors, even chaste ones, are self-absorbed and rigid in their way because, unlike most married people or monastics, they have a lot of opportunities to do what they want when they want. And this is even true for some priests and religious. That's certainly not what Paul was advocating in a time of red martyrdom and persecution, and is not what St. Anthony of Egypt was about when he pioneered the white martyrdom of the desert. And that's not what St. Benedict was about when he developed his more moderate rule for living in community. Christian marriage, with Christ as the primary goal, is more on par with a Benedictine way of life. It may not be white martyrdom exactly, but it can eventually lead to that, although it may take more time than it would for someone who is free to delve into a complete life of asceticism. So we've looked at monasticism. We looked at some misinterpretations. Now let's move towards what it means to have a truly Christian marriage. And I'll just try to dispel some more misinterpretations for a moment as we get to that. St. John Chrysostom is very clear. Yes, monasticism is the ideal, but he's also very clear that Christian marriage is close on its heels. The only difference is that you have a spouse. But the charge is the same. There's no longer the present distress of red martyrdom, but marriage can help you along the path to white martyrdom, even if it's not quite as direct as it would be for a monk. Christian marriage still has a monastic flavor because they derive from the same source. Paul's passage tells us that your call is to wage war with the world with all means at your disposal, and your spouse is given to help you to that end. So it's like this. Monasticism flings open the doors to holiness. Christian marriage does the same thing. The doors are almost as wide. You are not quite as free if you're married for all-night vigils and fasts and putting your life on the line. And your spiritual guide must take your spouse into account before assigning you asceticism. But you have other means at your disposal. You die to yourself for your spouse, and your spouse gives you someone else to guide you in the path to holiness. Yes, Christian marriage has a monastic flavor because they derive from the same source. St. Athanasius the Great was a vigorous promoter and defender of both monasticism and the true Christian conception of marriage. He called them together a twofold grace, the same grace expressed in two ways. It's impossible to do away with one without doing away with the other. The problem is that some people get married and don't follow this call because one or both of them bring the bachelor mentality into their marriage. Lust before marriage doesn't go away just because you get married. That just makes acting on your lust a lot easier. Marriage gets a bad rap when compared to monasticism because often you just have two people with a bachelor and a bachelorette mentality living together. And no wonder they're at loggerheads with one another. No wonder it doesn't seem holy compared to the monastic life. It may be a sacramentally valid marriage, but it doesn't reflect the analogy of Christ and his church the way Paul tells us to in his letter to the Ephesians. Even if the couple goes to church together, that's not enough to make a true Christian marriage. We can take this one step further. You can even be saying the rosary together and embrace a Catholic culture. But if you're each essentially living for yourself and not for your spouse and others, then you only have a veneer of Christian marriage. In its fullest sense, a true Christian marriage proclaims Christ by how you live. So I want to give an analogy to help us to reinforce this point a little bit further, then give real-life examples of holy Christian marriages where the heart of each spouse is not divided. The analogy is the example of a car. Not any car, but a Porsche. You can compare monasticism to driving a Porsche 911 on the way to holiness. Now, some people think marriage, if you get married, you can't have that kind of car because marriage limits how fast you can go. But let's be clear, no one begins with a Porsche. And as a bachelor, all you get is an old Ford 500 at best. But true Christian marriage puts you in a Porsche. Just the trim line is not quite as high as that of a monastic. But when you see a Porsche 911 on the road, you don't always pay attention to the trim line. They both turn heads. Now, let's consider how husbands and wives help one another to holiness by looking at these words from Ephesians 5, which directs us to that end. This is after he wrote to the Corinthians. He writes, Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. He's saying, lay down your life and inspire her to holiness. So now how does this compare to Paul's words to the Corinthians, that a married man is anxious about worldly affairs and his interests are divided? Again, that was written before he wrote these words to the Ephesians, giving a higher view of marriage. Christian marriage isn't for our own pleasure, but to serve. It reflects the undivided heart of monasticism. The patristic scholar, Dr. Josiah Trenum, gave these two examples of real-life holy marriages, and they're worth sharing at some length. Writing about 100 years after Paul, Tertullian, the great early church theologian, composed a letter to his wife in the event that he should die before her. First, he tells her that if he should die, to choose celibacy for Christ rather than remarry, because that's the highest calling. But then he talks about the high calling that they have already together. How beautiful, then, the marriage of two Christians, he writes. Two who are one in hope, one in desire, one in the way of life they follow, one in the religion they practice. They are as brother and sister, both servants of the same master. Nothing divides them, either in flesh or in spirit. They are in very truth two in one flesh, and where there is but one flesh, there is also but one spirit. They pray together, they worship together, they fast together, instructing one another, encouraging one another, strengthening one another. Together they are found in the church of God at his banquet. Side by side, they face difficulties and persecution, share their consolations. They have no secrets from one another. They never shun each other's company. They never bring sorrow to each other's hearts. They visit the sick together, and they allow each other to serve the poor and give alms. Psalms and hymns they sing to one another, and they challenge one another to see which shall chant better to the Lord. Hearing and seeing this, Christ rejoices. To such as these, he gives his peace. Where there are two together, there also he is present, and where he is, there the evil one is not. Now that, brothers and sisters, is Christian marriage. Marriage that models the undivided heart of monasticism. Married couples are not second-class citizens in the call to holiness. Rather, marriage gives us grace to move beyond the bachelor life to live self-sacrificial lives. So let's examine one more time the statement of Paul, that the married man's interests are divided. St. James the Persian, let's see how he shows this to be true. He was an influential official in the Persian court of 438 AD. He succeeded in keeping his faith in this pagan land that was hostile to Christianity. It helped that he was friends with the king, but when the king died and the king's son took over, his position was no longer so secure. So he did the unthinkable. He attended the worship of pagan gods. But then his wife and his son together wrote him a letter, and this is what she said. We have heard that the favor of a terrestrial king and the love of perishable resources of this century have made you abandon the eternal God, and we will have nothing to do with you anymore because you abandoned God. We want to have nothing in common with an apostate. It's over. We no longer exist for you. So what she's saying is, hold on to your eternal spouse more than your earthly spouse. Moved by this appeal, St. James prayed loudly to Christ in the hearing of soldiers, who then reported him to the Shah. Despite the Shah's urgings, St. James would not recant. He then endured one of the most prolonged martyrdoms recorded in history, praising God and proclaiming Christ throughout. Now let me ask you, were his interests divided? Did he just want to please his wife? Yes. But his interests were no longer divided in this. The opposite, because this was a truly Christian marriage. So she urged him to hold on to an undivided heart. She urged him to put the eternal wedding feast first. So before we conclude, let us consider, what state in life are you called to? First, let's acknowledge that one call covers them all. This is from the beginning of Ephesians 5. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. That's the call to all Christians in whatever state you are. And if you have a spouse already, then that's clear. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, to the married I give you a charge, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband. And are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. But then, what if you lose a spouse? Or what if you're not married yet? Paul says, so that he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do better. But then, in a slightly different context, Paul uses an analogy for marriage, and he says only this: let everyone lead the life which the Lord has assigned to him, and in which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. So, if you're actually called to marriage and you pursue monasticism, then you will not do well. St. Paisios of Mount Athos gave advice to someone who was questioning, at last, his call to monasticism. And this story is recounted by the monks who wrote his biography. A young man was inspired to pursue celibacy because he thought that was the best way, but yet he felt this persistent call to marriage. And so he went to the elder for advice. And here's what St. Paisios told him. He said, a woodworker chooses the best wood, and an ironworker chooses the best iron. If you are made of wood, then don't give yourself to the ironworker, because you will be burned up in his furnace. So the message is clear. Let your wood be formed for its intended purpose, for that will most glorify God. And so if you're single, then you've got three options. Be on the road to one or the other state of life as the means to dying to yourself and living for Christ. Or the third option, at the very least, get a spiritual director. Be under obedience to the best that your circumstances allow. Dedicate your life to holiness by serving Christ and others. And finally, a word to youth. We need more true monastics who have a true vision for this highest of callings. The problem is that in the church, we do have some people who just simply embraced mere celibacy, but yet with a bachelor mentality. That's not what we need. But as a true monastic, with obedience to your elders or to your abbot, in your service to your community, in your uncompromising call to Christ, you can be a model and an inspiration for true Christian marriage. So, Paul's charge to all of us is an undivided heart. And to consider what we would now call the monastic life, that is a universal call to holiness. He is writing in view, yes, of an impending distress and teaching the Corinthian church to give up everything for Jesus. You and I, likewise, whether monastic, married, or single, can take up that call. Use your state in life to embrace the impending distress and to wage warfare with the world. Cast all hindrances aside and die to yourself in the name of Christ.